Why did the Greeks sleep with men and take pride in it? It wasn't a secret. It wasn't shameful. In ancient Athens, a man could walk hand in hand with his younger male lover through the city square, and no one would bat an eye. Statues, poems, epics, all celebrated it. Love between men was not just accepted, it was revered. So the question remains, why? To understand it, forget everything you think you know about sexuality today. The Greeks didn't see the world in terms of gay or straight. They saw it in terms of power, beauty, education, and virtue. And within that framework, relationships between older and younger men, often between a mentor and his student, were not only tolerated, they were seen as essential, because love for the Greeks wasn't just about desire, it was about shaping the soul. The philosopher Plato once wrote that the highest form of love was the one that inspired the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. And who better to inspire a young mind than someone who had already walked further on the path? In this context, male lovers weren't seen as immoral, they were seen as sacred, part of a cultural structure that trained the next generation of citizens, thinkers, and warriors. But of course, not everyone sees it that way today. We look back with confusion, sometimes even mockery. The Greeks were gay has become a meme, a joke, something thrown around online with a laugh. And that laugh hides a deeper discomfort, because behind it lies a reality that challenges modern ideas of masculinity, identity, and love. So let's take it seriously. Let's go back, way back, to a time when Athens ruled the Aegean, when men wore robes and sandals and debated in marble halls. Let's step into a world where love between men wasn't an exception, it was an ideal. And before we go on, I want to hear from you. If you lived in ancient Greece, do you think you'd be comfortable with how love worked back then? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Next, we dig into the roots, mythology, gods, warriors, and philosophers, and why love between men was more than a choice, it was a foundation. In the beginning, there were gods, and the gods, as the Greeks saw them, were not distant or perfect. They were passionate, flawed, human in their desires. Zeus, king of the gods, famously turned into an eagle and abducted the beautiful Trojan prince Ganymede, carrying him to Olympus to become his cupbearer, and, implicitly, his lover. This myth wasn't whispered in the dark. It was carved into pottery, sung in verse, celebrated in ritual. It was not just accepted, it was glorified. From the divine to the human, this pattern repeated. Heroic figures, admired again, and then immortalized, often had deep emotional and physical bonds with other men. Achilles and Patroclus, Heracles and Hylas. The greatest warriors, the most legendary heroes, were remembered not just for their strength or bravery, but for their love. But it wasn't just about romance or sex. That's where most modern misunderstandings begin. In Greek culture, particularly in Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, these relationships followed a specific pattern called paiderastia, literally boy love, but it wasn't predatory. The ideal form of paiderastia involved an older man, the Erastes, lover, and a younger male, typically in his teens, called the eromenos, beloved. The age gap was deliberate because the relationship was as much about mentorship as it was about intimacy. The older man was expected to be a guide, morally, intellectually, and socially. He taught the youth how to speak in assemblies, how to reason with clarity, how to behave with dignity. The sexual component was present, yes, but strictly regulated. Society demanded that the relationship remain respectful and mutual. If an older man simply seduced young boys for pleasure, he was seen as vulgar and dishonorable. What mattered was the bond, the growth, the trust, the shared ambition. And this wasn't just tolerated in private life. It was part of the state's ideal vision of citizenship. Philosophers like Plato, Xenophon, and Aeschines wrote extensively about how these relationships could elevate both men. Even the great Socrates was known for his deep, intense emotional connections with younger men, particularly Alcibiades. In Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades famously crashes a dinner party drunk, delivers a heartfelt speech about Socrates' magnetic influence, and confesses his own failed attempt to seduce him. That same text also holds one of the clearest defenses of this ideal. The playwright Aristophanes, speaking through Plato's pen, tells a myth that humans were once whole, male-male, female-female, male-female beings split apart by Zeus, and that love is simply our search for the missing half. Some seek the opposite sex, others seek the same. In both, the desire is for completion. But here's the key. In ancient Greece, love between men wasn't seen as gay. That word, that concept, simply didn't exist. The Greeks didn't think in terms of gender attraction. They thought in terms of active and passive roles, of power and purpose. A man could love a woman, marry her, raise children with her, and still enter a loving, intimate mentorship with a younger male. This wasn't contradictory, it was complementary. The relationships were also deeply tied to aesthetics. The Greeks revered beauty, not just physical, but spiritual. The male body, especially the youthful male body, was considered the height of natural form. It was sculpted, painted, idealized. To love a beautiful boy was, in a way, to love beauty itself, and thus to get closer to the divine. And yet this wasn't some chaotic free-for-all. There were social rules. The younger male was expected to be modest, to resist too easily giving in, to ensure the older man truly cared and invested in his development. Publicly, the younger man had to maintain his dignity. If he seemed too eager, too submissive, too flirtatious, he risked losing honor, because even then, reputation mattered. Love was sacred, but so was restraint. It's easy to project modern labels onto this, to look for binaries, to ask, were they gay or straight? But to the Greeks, that question would make no sense. What mattered was the virtue of the relationship. Was it honorable? Was it meaningful? Did it produce better men? And there's another reason this practice was normalized. It was entwined with power. Older men who mentored young protégé had influence, legacy, continuity, and young men who were mentored had access to networks, to learning, to advancement. The relationship wasn't hidden. It was strategic. And in a society obsessed with competition and excellence, that strategy made sense. Still, even in that context, not everyone agreed. Some thinkers worried that these relationships could slip into exploitation or vanity. The playwright Euripides mocked certain men for chasing boys instead of leading armies, and Plato himself, later in life, began to criticize the physical aspects of these bonds, promoting instead a purely spiritual, intellectual connection. But even then, he didn't condemn the love itself. He refined it. So what are we left with? A culture where male-male relationships were not just accepted, but institutionalized. They were rituals of mentorship, aesthetics, politics, and yes, desire. The Greeks didn't hide it. They didn't shame it. They celebrated it in gymnasiums, in theaters, on the battlefield. And they believed that through such love, men could become something more than they were alone. Next, how that mentorship shaped warriors, leaders, and legends, and why the path from student to citizen passed through the hands of a lover. To understand the true depth of male relationships in ancient Greece, we must look at where they began, not in temples or battlefields, but in schools, gymnasiums, and family courtyards. Love between men, especially between an older mentor and a younger protege, wasn't just romantic or physical. It was educational, it was formative, and it was everywhere. The Greeks didn't just value education, they built their identity on it. To be a citizen of Athens meant to be trained in body, mind, and spirit. This training didn't come from institutions or formal lectures. It came through personal bonds. It came from the Erastes, the older man, guiding his Eromenos, the youth, into adulthood. And that guidance wasn't just about facts, it was about aret, the Greek word for excellence. Education in this context was not detached from emotion. The Greeks believed that true learning came through admiration, intimacy, and respect. If a boy admired his mentor, he would want to emulate him. If the mentor loved his student, he would want to protect and elevate him. This bond, deep, emotional, and often physical, created not just scholars, but leaders. In Sparta, the bond took on an even more intense form. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and placed into the agoge, a brutal state-run training system. They learned to endure pain, obey commands, kill without hesitation. But they were also placed under the care of older warriors, mentors who were expected to teach them not just tactics, but courage, discipline, and loyalty. These bonds were physical too, but they weren't casual, they were strategic. A Spartan warrior would fight harder beside someone he loved. He would die to protect him, and that, to the Spartans, was the point. This wasn't seen as perversion, it was seen as patriotism. In Athens, the process was different, more intellectual, more artistic, but no less emotional. The gymnasium was a key setting. Boys trained naked, under the watchful eyes of their elders. But this wasn't voyeurism. The naked body was revered as a symbol of balance and virtue. Physical beauty reflected inner nobility. And those who admired that beauty were expected to act with restraint and dignity. The ideal Erastes was not a predator. He didn't seduce boys in alleys. He didn't chase them with gifts or promises. He earned their admiration through character. And the ideal Eromenos was not a passive object. He had power too, the power to accept or reject, to demand sincerity, to shape the bond into something meaningful. Poets and playwrights often captured this balance. In works by Theognis or Pindar, we find older men writing love poems to their younger companions, praising their beauty, yes, but also their wit, their promise, their moral clarity. It was not lust disguised as culture. It was culture defined by love, and love itself was not separated from ethics. A man who loved without self-control was mocked. A boy who gave himself too easily was pitied. The highest praise was reserved for those who loved wisely, taught generously, and grew together. One of the clearest depictions of this comes again from Plato. In the Phaedrus, Socrates speaks about the lover and the beloved as a pair of charioteers pulled by winged horses. When love is ruled by wisdom, the horses fly toward the heavens. When it's ruled by base desire, they crash. The metaphor is clear. Love can elevate us, but only if we steer it well. This model of mentorship love had ripple effects across society. Politics, military strategy, even law were influenced by these bonds. In the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite fighting unit, 150 male couples were paired together. Why? because lovers would fight with more courage, stand with more resolve, and never abandon each other in battle. And they didn't. The sacred band was undefeated for decades, until finally overrun by the armies of Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, who reportedly mourned their bravery. That's the legacy these bonds left behind. They didn't weaken men, they made them stronger. Even at home, the effects were visible. A young man who had been properly mentored would later marry, raise children, and in turn become a mentor himself. The cycle continued. These relationships were not replacements for marriage. They were a prelude to it, a kind of personal renaissance. The Greeks didn't see a contradiction in loving a man deeply and later loving a wife differently. Each love served a purpose. Each was respected in its own way. But all of this required rules: social, ethical, even legal. Athenian law, for instance, prohibited citizens from prostituting themselves, even voluntarily. A man who had done so lost the right to speak in public assembly. Why? Because love, in their eyes, must be based on honor, not transaction. Once corrupted, it lost its moral force. And this moral force was everywhere: in classrooms, in gymnasiums, in symposia, where older men and their protégés debated politics and poetry over wine. These weren't drunken parties. They were social laboratories, a place where ideas were tested, and so were loyalties. To modern ears, this all sounds foreign, maybe even uncomfortable. But that's the point. Ancient Greece wasn't like us. Their views on love, gender, and identity broke our categories. They weren't primitive. They were deliberate. And for centuries, this model worked. It produced thinkers like Aristotle, leaders like Pericles, warriors like Epaminondas. These weren't just men of action. They were men shaped by love. Love not as desire alone, but as a tool for transformation. Next, how this love reached the throne in the story of Alexander the Great and his most trusted companion, a man he called his equal in every way. He was the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. A boy who became a general by 16, a king by 20, and by 30 had claimed an empire stretching from Greece to India. But at the heart of Alexander the Great's meteoric rise was a quieter story, a story of love, a story of one man who never left his side: Hephaestion. To the public, Hephaestion was a general, a statesman, a companion, but to Alexander he was more, much more. They met as boys, both students of Aristotle, both heirs to powerful families in Macedon. From the beginning, their bond was different. They learned together, trained together, ate together, and as they grew into men, that bond only deepened. Ancient sources speak of them in unambiguous terms. They shared tents, shared confidences, shared loyalty. Some say they even shared a bed. But it wasn't just about passion, it was about equality. Alexander once said, "Hephaestion is myself." That wasn't metaphor, that was conviction. In a world where kings guarded their pride, where generals surrounded themselves with flatterers, Alexander made a different choice. He kept at his side someone who could challenge him, calm him, and remind him who he was. They were, as the Greeks admired most, philoi, not just lovers, but soul-bound friends. Plato would have smiled. The philosophers of Athens had long spoken of the ideal love, one that inspired greatness, that combined the body and the mind, that fused ambition with trust. Alexander and Hephaestion were the living proof. Their relationship echoed the myths they grew up with: Achilles and Patroclus, Heracles and Aeolus. Legendary heroes bound by more than blood or oath, bound by love. Alexander even carried a copy of Homer's Iliad with him on campaign, sleeping with it beneath his pillow. And when Hephaestion died, it was to Achilles that he turned for solace. But we're not there yet. First, let's talk about how they ruled together. Hephaestion wasn't a shadow in the background. He was a commander in his own right. He led troops, managed logistics, negotiated with cities. Alexander trusted him with responsibilities no one else received, including overseeing the rebuilding of Persepolis, the ancient Persian capital. In public ceremonies, he stood near the throne, and in private councils, he spoke freely. That kind of access was unprecedented. Some of the older Macedonian generals hated it. They whispered behind Alexander's back, called Hephaestion unworthy, too soft, too favored. But Alexander didn't care. He didn't apologize for it. He elevated Hephaestion not despite the gossip, but in defiance of it. There's one story that reveals everything. When Alexander married Roxana, a Persian noblewoman, he also arranged for Hephaestion to marry her sister. It wasn't political theater, it was symbolic. By marrying into the same royal line, they became kin, one more way to intertwine their lives forever. But even empires end, and no man is immune to grief. In 324 BCE, after years of war, Alexander's army was finally returning west. They stopped in the city of Ecbatana to rest and resupply. There, Hephaestion fell ill. Sudden, unexplained. Some say it was typhoid, others, poison. Within days, he was gone. Alexander's reaction was apocalyptic. He locked himself in his quarters, refusing to eat. He tore his clothes, wept openly, and lay beside the body for hours. He cut the manes from his horses, banned music across the city, and demanded mourning rituals, usually reserved for royalty. He sent messengers to the oracle of Siwa in Egypt, asking if Hephaestion could be deified, turned into a god. When the priests agreed, he ordered temples built in his honor, and then he planned a funeral unlike any the world had seen. A towering pyre, said to be over 60 meters high, adorned with gold, ivory, and carvings of heroic battles. Thousands of soldiers stood in silence. Alexander himself lit the fire. His face, according to legend, was blank, not from peace, but from a grief too big to show. This was no ordinary mourning. It was the kind of loss that rips through the soul, leaves everything unsteady. Alexander never truly recovered. Within a year, he too would be dead, struck down in Babylon, just 32 years old. Some say he died of illness, others of poison, but many believe he simply stopped wanting to live. Without Hephaestion, there was no point. Their story's important not just because it's tragic, but because it was public. A king and his lover, a warrior in his shadow. In a time when power ruled everything, Alexander allowed love to stand beside it. He showed the world that greatness doesn't require solitude, that even the strongest need someone to lean on, and he wasn't alone in that belief. Throughout the Greek world, stories like his were honored, not hidden. The bond between men was seen as noble, even sacred, especially when it produced courage, loyalty, and honor. But that wouldn't last forever. A new empire was rising, one with different values, different gods, and a very different view of love. Next, we travel back to myth and legend, to Achilles and Patroclus, and the battlefield where love became blood and friendship became legend. Long before Alexander wept over Hephaestion, before Plato wrote about soulmates, before the gymnasiums of Athens filled with youthful laughter and wisdom, there was Troy. The story of the Trojan War is, at its heart, a story of love. Not just Helen's, the face that launched 1,000 ships, but another quieter, deeper love, the love between Achilles and Patroclus. It's a relationship that scholars still debate. Were they lovers? Were they brothers in arms? Were they both? To the ancient Greeks, there was no question. They were bonded. Body, heart, soul. Homer in the Iliad never uses modern terms. But the way Achilles responds to Patroclus' death, the anguish, the madness, the complete unraveling, leaves no doubt. This wasn't just grief, it was devastation. Let's step back. Achilles was Greece's greatest warrior, a demigod, the son of Thetis, feared by enemies, revered by allies. He was unstoppable until he withdrew from battle in a rage, and while the Greeks begged him to return, he refused. Only Patroclus could reach him. Patroclus, the gentler of the two, the one with soft eyes and a steady voice, the one who had shared Achilles' tent since boyhood. He was the bridge between the warrior and the world. When Achilles refused to fight, Patroclus put on his armor and rode into battle in his place, knowing it might mean death, and it did. Hector, the prince of Troy, struck him down, and when Achilles learned of it, the world changed. He didn't just grieve, he tore at his hair, he covered himself in ash. He let out a cry so loud it echoed across the sea. Then he returned to battle, not for glory, not for strategy, but for revenge. He slaughtered Hector. He dragged his body around the city walls. He rejected food, sleep, mercy. And when Patroclus' body was finally burned, Achilles held the urn of ashes close to his heart, whispering promises to join him soon. He kept that promise. This story mattered to the Greeks. It was retold in plays, poems, symposia. Plato himself in the Symposium cites Achilles as the ultimate lover because he chose death to honor his beloved. It was, in their eyes, the highest form of loyalty, not the love of comfort, but of sacrifice, and they weren't alone. Other myths echoed the same theme: Heracles and Hylas, Orpheus and Calais. Even Apollo, the god of the sun, was said to have loved a beautiful Spartan youth named Hyacinth, whose accidental death caused Apollo such sorrow that he created a flower from his blood. The Greeks didn't shy away from these stories. They embraced them because they believed that love, especially love between men, could be a source of strength, tragedy, and transcendence. But it wasn't just about myth. These stories shaped real behavior. Young men were encouraged to see their mentors not only as teachers, but as figures worthy of deep emotional connection. When Theban warriors stood shoulder to shoulder in the sacred band, they were told to fight not just for Greece, but for the man beside them, for the one who held their heart. This wasn't romanticization, it was military policy, and it worked. The sacred band, 150 male couples, chosen for both skill and loyalty, became one of the most feared units in the ancient world. They held the line at Leuctra, shattered the Spartan army, and redefined what courage meant. They didn't fight because they were ordered to. They fought because they would rather die than let their lover fall. Even in death, they stayed together. When Philip of Macedon defeated Thebes years later, he visited the site of the final battle. There, he found the fallen sacred band, still side by side, refusing to retreat even as they were overrun. Philip, a hardened king, was said to have wept at the sight. "Perish any man," he reportedly said, "who suspects that these men did or suffered anything unseemly." It was one of the last great public acknowledgments of this kind of love. Soon a new culture was rising, one with different gods, different values. Rome, and the Romans, while inheriting Greek art and architecture, did not inherit their views on love. To the Romans, masculinity meant dominance. Submission, emotional, sexual, social, was weakness. Male-male relationships weren't banned, but they were redefined. The ideal Roman man could take a male partner, but only if that partner was a slave, a foreigner, or clearly beneath him. Equality was not part of the picture. Greek love, with its nuance, its mutual respect, its soul-binding intimacy, didn't fit the Roman mold, and so slowly it faded, but not entirely. Poets like Virgil and Catullus kept the flame alive. So did quiet scholars passing down copies of Plato and Homer. The stories of Achilles and Patroclus, of Alexander and Hephaestion, survived, buried in libraries, whispered in academies, and centuries later, they would bloom again. Next, how Rome and Christianity rewrote the rules, turning sacred love into sin and pride into silence. As the Greek world slowly succumbed to the weight of its own contradictions, a new power rose on the horizon. Rome. The Roman Empire would take much from Greece, its gods, its art, its military strategies, but it would not inherit the Greeks' ideas about love between men. The Romans were builders, warriors, and pragmatists. Their ideal of masculinity was defined by strength, control, and dominance. They glorified the virtues of a man, which encompassed honor, courage, and self-discipline. But while Rome embraced many aspects of Greek culture, their views on love, especially male-male love, diverged sharply from the Greeks' open acceptance. In the Roman world, relationships between men were possible, but they were viewed very differently from their Greek counterparts. Love between men was acceptable, but only if it was defined by a strict hierarchy. The older man, the vir, the active participant, could take a younger man or a slave as his lover, but only if that lover was in a submissive, passive role. The very idea of a reciprocal, equal relationship between two free men was not just frowned upon, it was incomprehensible. What does this mean for the Greek ideal? At first glance, it might seem that the Romans simply didn't care about love in the way the Greeks did. But that would be too simplistic. In fact, the Romans did care deeply about love, but they viewed it primarily through the lens of power. In Roman society, the paterfamilias, the head of the household, was both the ruler and protector. His authority was absolute, and so his relationships with younger men or slaves were understood as extensions of that authority. A man who took a younger man as his lover wasn't just acting on desire, he was asserting control. The relationship was a demonstration of his power, not an emotional or intellectual connection. A Roman man who had a male lover would often treat the relationship as something akin to an apprenticeship, with the lover being groomed for future roles, either in the military or in society, depending on his status. But Rome didn't just change the way men loved each other. It redefined the very concept of love itself. Where the Greeks saw love as an essential and powerful force that could elevate the soul and strengthen the body, the Romans saw love as a complex tool to be used in the service of social and political goals. However, this Roman conception of love was not universally accepted, even within Rome itself. Roman elites, particularly those who were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and culture, still clung to the more Greek-like traditions of mentoring relationships. The philosopher Cicero, for instance, often advocated for the benefits of amicitia, friendship between men, stressing the importance of mutual respect and affection. Similarly, the poet Catullus wrote about his love for his male lover with an intensity and passion that echoed Greek sentiment. Despite these voices, however, the dominant view remained one of hierarchical relationships. For the Romans, love was never about equality. It was about roles, power, and performance. But then came the rise of Christianity, and everything changed. Christianity brought with it a radical transformation of values. Early Christian thinkers, building on Jewish monotheism and Roman law, began to redefine the very nature of human relationships. For them, the body and its desires were inherently sinful, and love, especially sexual love, was something to be controlled, repressed, or transformed. By the time of Constantine's reign in the early 4th century AD, Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christian moral teachings, based on the writings of Paul and the early church fathers, spread like wildfire across the empire. The Greeks and Romans had long believed that love, in its ideal form, was a force that could transcend the physical. Now with Christianity, that transcendence came at a price. Love, according to Christian doctrine, was to be understood only within the confines of marriage. Sexuality, once viewed as a natural expression of love, became a sinful act, relegated to the private sphere of the married couple, with the sole purpose of procreation. The idea of eros, or romantic sexual love, was relegated to the shadows of sinful desire, while agape, the love of God and fellow man, became the highest form of love. This redefinition of love had profound effects. The ideal of male-male love, that had thrived in Greece and even in parts of Rome, began to fade into the background. What had once been seen as a path to virtue and wisdom was now condemned as immoral, unnatural, and incompatible with Christian values. And yet, even as Christianity took hold, remnants of the old Greek ideals lingered. The love between Achilles and Patroclus, the bond between Alexander and Hephaestion, the deep connection between men in the sacred band, all of these continued to capture the imagination of later generations, even if they were now seen as tragic and problematic examples of a past long gone. In the medieval period, the classical ideals of Greek love were buried under layers of Christian doctrine and Roman law. But even then, the power of these stories didn't disappear. In the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered Greek texts, and with them, the idea that love could be both spiritual and physical, both sacred and deeply human. The works of Plato and Aristotle, the myths of Homer and Virgil, came flooding back, inspiring a new generation to reconsider the nature of male-male love. Yet the shadow of Christianity continued to hang over the Western world. The idea that love between men could be pure, equal, and redemptive never fully returned to its former place of honor. Instead, it was relegated to the margins, whispered about in private, while public life continued to be governed by rigid sexual and moral codes. And even today, we are still grappling with the legacy of these shifts in thought. Next, we look at how these ancient ideals have been resurrected, challenged, and reinterpreted in the modern world, and how the ancient Greeks, despite centuries of suppression, continue to influence our understanding of love. Despite the centuries of silence, despite the repression imposed by the rise of Christianity and the transformation of the Roman Empire, the ideals of ancient Greek love never truly disappeared. They lay dormant, like seeds waiting for the right moment to sprout, and in the modern world, they have begun to bloom again. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Western societies underwent profound changes in their understanding of sexuality and identity, the ancient Greek approach to love between men became a touchstone, a reminder of a time when such bonds were seen as noble and transformative, rather than shameful or deviant. The rediscovery of Greek philosophy and the works of poets like Pindar, Theonis, and even Plato provided new and at times controversial ways of thinking about male-male love. During the Renaissance, a renewed interest in classical antiquity brought the Greeks' views on love back into intellectual circles. Humanists and philosophers, inspired by the works of Plato and Aristotle, revived the idea that love could transcend mere physicality, that it could be a force for moral and intellectual growth. Figures like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and many others were inspired by the Greek ideals of male beauty and the bond between men, even if they did not openly live by them. But it wasn't until the 20th century, with the rise of the modern LGBTQ+ movement, that the Greek legacy began to resurface in public discourse. Activists and scholars began to reclaim the ideals of ancient Greece, arguing that the love between men should not be stigmatized, but celebrated as an integral part of human history. In the early part of the 20th century, when homosexuality was still criminalized in much of the world, authors like Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, and Christopher Isherwood began to write openly about same-sex love, drawing inspiration from the classical world. The concept of philia, a deep, non-sexual affection, often between men, became a counterpoint to the stifling norms of Victorian and Edwardian society. For the first time in centuries, the ancient Greek model of love between men began to find a place in the broader cultural conversation. But this revival wasn't without its challenges. Critics, particularly from conservative and religious circles, denounced the idea that such love could be anything other than morally corrupt. Yet for every voice of condemnation, there were more who sought to revive the idea that male love was a powerful and enriching force, one that could build community, inspire loyalty, and even foster artistic and intellectual achievement. By the mid-20th century, as homosexuality began to be decriminalized in many parts of the world, the ancient Greek tradition was increasingly seen as a model for personal freedom and self-expression. In the aftermath of World War II and the civil rights movements of the 1960s, societies around the world began to question old norms and explore new possibilities for human relationships. Scholars and writers such as Michel Foucault, who famously explored the history of sexuality, began to trace the roots of contemporary ideas about gender and sexuality back to ancient Greece. Foucault, in his works on the history of sexuality, acknowledged the Greek concept of paiderastia as a form of love that, despite its exclusion by later traditions, offered a profound sense of moral and intellectual fulfillment. Yet the legacy of Greek love didn't just influence intellectuals, it influenced how people lived. The idea that love between men could be more than just a physical connection, that it could be about companionship, intellectual partnership, and shared growth, resonated deeply with those in the LGBT community, especially as they sought ways to forge meaningful relationships in a society that often saw them as deviant. The influence of Greek love was also evident in the emergence of modern gay pride movements, especially in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The reclaiming of love between men as a legitimate, beautiful, and even sacred bond has been a critical element in the fight for equality and recognition. The term philia was often invoked to highlight the non-romantic, yet deeply intimate, connections that many men in same-sex relationships sought. These relationships weren't based on exploitation, but rather on respect, mutual admiration, and affection, all values that were central to the Greek tradition. In recent years, there has been a renewed interest in understanding the classical world's approach to same-sex relationships. Some scholars even argue that the ancient Greeks provide a model for modern-day relationships that transcend the binary ideas of gay and straight. The ancient Greeks' openness to same-sex love was not defined by labels, but by the depth of the connection, intellectual, emotional, and physical, between individuals. Modern philosophy and queer theory, for example, often draw on Greek ideas about love as a way to challenge the rigid frameworks that have dominated Western thinking about sexuality. The classical ideal of mentorship, in particular, offers a potent critique of contemporary power dynamics. Instead of seeing same-sex relationships through the lens of subordination or dominance, as Rome and Christianity eventually framed them, the Greek model sees them as fundamentally human, grounded in equality and mutual respect. But what about today? Are we truly free of the cultural hang-ups that centuries of repression have wrought? In many ways, we are only beginning to reclaim the ideals of Greek love. Yes, we have made tremendous strides in terms of acceptance and understanding, but the path to full equality and recognition is still ongoing. While much has changed in the way that society treats same-sex love, there is still a long way to go in terms of breaking down the barriers that prevent true equality. The ancient Greeks understood the value of love as a transformative force, a way of bringing people together and elevating them. In our modern age, we must remember that this love, in all its forms, is still as powerful as ever. So as we look back at the stories of Achilles and Patroclus, of Alexander and Hephaestion, of the sacred bonds formed in Greek gymnasiums and on battlefields, let us not just see them as relics of a bygone era. Let us see them as reminders of what love can be, not confined by labels, not limited by gender, but limitless in its capacity to shape and change us, to push us toward greatness, and to unite us in the pursuit of truth, beauty, and virtue. And as we look forward, let us continue to ask, how will love be defined in the future? What lessons will we learn from the Greeks? How will their legacy guide us as we forge new connections in a rapidly changing world? For the Greeks, love was a source of strength, a source of pride, and perhaps in the end, it still can be.